Yeah, I'm primarily a macro analyst. I look at technicals and fundamentals, but I really kind of bring the geopolitical and international and economic perspective to bear. So that's kind of what I do. But this is a very unusual situation where you sort of get a macro view of something and you realize, well, wait, there's a bigger macro view and then an even bigger one behind that. So you have to kind of keep going through the layers. So, of course, enormous amount of attention focused right now on the war between Israel and Hamas. But I still, I follow the Ukrainian war closely. I read a lot of history. We kind of know what happened on October 7th. The details, I don't want to dwell on it, but they're...
In this video, Jim Rickards discusses the complex interplay of macroeconomic factors, geopolitical events, and financial warfare. He analyzes the recent war between Israel and Hamas, drawing parallels with the Ukrainian war. Rickards emphasizes the potential impact on oil prices, highlighting the initial surge and the subsequent stabilization. He points to a broader economic context, noting a drop in U.S. gasoline consumption and potential negative economic signs. The discussion delves into the failure of Russian sanctions and the unintended consequences, especially the freezing of central bank reserves, creating incentives for nations to move away from the dollar. Rickards underscores the importance of understanding the interconnected layers of geopolitics and finance in assessing global economic stability.
They're of the highest order of horror. What we don't know is, does this thing escalate? And this is where, for investors, I think the impact on oil prices is so important. So when the wars started, we said, oil's gone to 100 or 150 or whatever. It hasn't, and there was no particular reason to think that it would. What did happen is oil prices, they went up a little bit. I think like $85, maybe $88 a barrel, but they kind of stabilized. But now put this in the global economic context, particularly the United States, gasoline consumption is dropping in the United States. The consumers sort of tapped out. They were spending their savings and using up their credit cards. Well, there are limits to that. Your savings get to zero and your credit card is tapped out and you can only make the minimum payment. At 20% interest, your principal is going to double in 3 years. So that's not going anywhere. It kind of looks like the consumers slammed on the brakes maybe around the middle of August, certainly in September. If gasoline consumption is down, that's usually pretty inelastic demand. You still got to get to work and take kids to school and all that. But gasoline consumption is down, which is a really negative economic sign. So a lot of other things are deflating. So with that as background, one would expect that the wholesale price of oil, WTI and Brent would come down, but it hasn't. So I would say, if you said, what's the impact of the war so far, is that the South oil prices have soared, but they haven't come down. There's a floor. Now the question is, off of that floor, does it stay there, or does something else happen that causes it to spike up to that $120, $150 barrel oil that some people have been talking about? But this is a financial war as much as anything, and the U.S. is losing. The Russian sanctions have failed. I teach a seminar in financial warfare at the U.S. Army War College, and I told my 2022 class, this is April 2022, not long after the Ukraine war started, I said these sanctions are going to fail, and worse than that, there'll be blowback that's going to hurt the United States more than it's hurt Russia. That's happened. So we know a lot. There's a lot we don't know. I think those are the things that are really going to tip the global economy into a global recession, if not a financial crisis. Well, right, I've been doing this for a long time. I was a facilitator and a participant in the Pentagon's first ever financial war game in 2009 at the Warfare Analysis Laboratory, part of Johns Hopkins. It's a top secret lab about halfway between Washington and Baltimore. The Pentagon did not need my help in war games, but they did need outside expertise in financial war. They had never done that before. And I even recruited, and they sort of, they had the FBI and the CIA and the Treasury and think tanks, what I call the usual suspects. I said, look, if you want a really good financial war, it involves, lying, cheating, and deception. We got to get some Wall Street people in here, because that's what they're good at. So I was able to recruit a top private equity manager and one of the top analysts for one of the biggest banks in the world. So we got a little Wall Street expertise in the room. It went extremely well. By the way, the scenario we did in 2009 was that Russia and China were going to accumulate gold and start a new gold-backed currency and try to run the dollar off the road. So we did that years ago. I warned the Pentagon. The whole idea of a war game is not to do today's war. It's to look 5, 10 years down the road and help people prepare for what might be coming. we're there now. I mean, I talked about the BRICS and other multilateral efforts to get out from under the dollar. But I did another war game, what we call tabletop. You just get 11, 15 experts around the table, and you talk it through. It wasn't quite as elaborate in that sense as the 2009 war game. But I was sitting one seat away from one of the top officials at the United States Treasury. He was like the dollar guy, liaison to Asia, Japan, and China, and so forth. So I basically tell them the greatest threat to the dollar doesn't come from overseas. It comes from the United States itself. We're the ones destroying the dollar by overusing sanctions. And that's what I said at the time. I said sanctions can be effective, but when you overuse them, you create an incentive for your adversaries to get out from under the dollar system, to come up with alternatives. Easier said than done, takes a long time, but they begin working on that because they don't want to be the next victim. If you say, what was this, I hate to use cliches, but the straw that broke the camel's back is when the United States froze about $250 billion of treasury notes and securities owned by the Central Bank of Russia. Those were their reserves. They had them invested, not all of them, but a lot of the reserves in U.S. treasuries. We froze them. That was unprecedented. I mean, we kicked Iran out of SWIFT, and we did the same thing with Russia. We did a lot else to Russia, but freezing central bank reserves of a major global power, largest atomic nuclear arsenal in the world, et cetera, had never been done before. Well, think about that from the perspective of, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, India, Turkey, a lot of other countries. You're sitting there saying, well, if they did that to Russia, what if I do something the United States doesn't like? Are they going to freeze my reserves? And the answer is maybe yes. So you've now created a very powerful incentive to get out from under dollar hegemony. It didn't come from them, it came from us because we were overusing the reserves. So I pointed this out in this war game I'm describing. And this treasury official, he kind of like slammed both hands, like face down on the table, like boom, like that. He goes, the dollar has been the global reserve currency. It is the global reserve currency today, and it will always be the global reserve currency. And I turned around and said, I feel like I'm in Whitehall in 1913 listening to John Bull say sterling is the global reserve currency and it always will be. And then, 30 years later, it was done. But you can't get through. I mean, I always get the meetings. I mean, I've been in the Pentagon Office of Net Assessment, which is their futurist think tanks. I've been in the Treasury and the Fed, et cetera. The only people who kind of understand what I'm saying are the military and the Office of Secretary of Defense, because as I say to them, I say, when the rest of the government screws up, it ends up in your lap. Like the military, and that's going to happen in Israel, the military is going to have to come in and pick up the pieces that other people in the State Department, the Fed, and the Treasury have, scrambled. So they kind of get it, but the Treasury doesn't get it. The Fed's kind of not, they don't really do international stuff. It's not part of their mandate, so-called. The White House, Janet Yellen doesn't understand anything we're talking about right now. She's a statistics geek from Berkeley, probably a high IQ, no common sense, no real international experience, so she doesn't understand this. So when I taught my financial warfare seminar at the U.S. Army War College in 2022, as I mentioned, I told them it was all brand new. Sanctions was coming. I understood them. I worked with sanctions for decades. And I said, they're powerful. They're going to fail. They won't work for a country like Russia. Russia has too many alternatives. And the big factor was that nobody joined in. China has not joined the sanctions. India, Brazil, Turkey. These are large, powerful countries. None of them have joined the sanctions. So there's no coalition of the willing. It's like a non-coalition of the unwilling. When Russia has that many trading partners who won't join the U.S. sanctions, they have a lot of alternatives. They have other places to sell oil, other ways to get currency payments, other ways to keep their economy afloat. We're losing the financial war to the BRICS. Not all at once. These things can take years to play out. But we're doing it to ourselves by abusing sanctions. They're weaponizing the dollar. Well, we weaponize the dollar. You should expect that trading partners are going to weaponize back. And that's what's happening.